Little Van Diemen grew up when times were tough, money was scarce, and there were many hardships to endure. But little Van Diemen had one consolation: swimming. He loved to swim in the rivers and canals. He became faster and stronger, and he won every swimming meet he ever entered in his local community. One year, he wanted to move on to the regional championships, but times were tough and money was scarce and there were many hardships to endure. However, with some help, he went and he won everything. And so the next step was the national competition, but he didn't know how he could afford to go because times were tough and money was scarce and there were many hardships to endure. Yet there were those who helped, and so somehow he managed. And he won the national swimming championship, which meant he was entered into the European one. But there was no government funding in those days because times were tough and money was scarce and there were many hardships to endure. But little Van Diemen worked hard, hitchhiked part of the way, and made his way to the competition where once again he won everything. This meant world championships, but they were in America and he didn't see how he could go. Times were tough, money was scarce, there were many hardships to endure. But friends and neighbors, countrymen all chipped in. Still, he only had about half the fare for the crossing. But he finally convinced the captain of a sailing ship to take him as far as his money would go, and then he would swim the rest. Captain agreed, they sailed, and when they reached that point, he cheerfully dove into the water and began swimming because times were tough and money was scarce and there were many hardships to endure. As he fell farther behind, the other passengers pleaded with the captain to have mercy. Finally, they stopped the ship. They picked up little Van Diemen, and the captain said, "I'll take you the rest of the way if you'll do one of your beautiful swan dives from the crow's nest." Little Van Diemen happily agreed, climbed up, and dove. Just as he launched into that wonderful dive, a gust of wind and a rogue wave twisted the ship around, and little Van Diemen landed with a thud on the deck. Gasping, the people flocked to where he had fallen. The ship doctor went to examine him. But just then, little Van Diemen got up and shook himself. Everyone was amazed. But little Van Diemen shrugged it off and said, "It's nothing. I'm used to hardships." Okay, the Apostle Paul was also used to hardships. In 2 Corinthians 11, he recounts the imprisonments, the floggings, the beatings, the shipwrecks, the attacks, and other hardships he endured for the sake of the gospel. Then in chapter 12, he shares that he had a thorn in the flesh. He doesn't clarify what that was. Some think it was a physical ailment or a handicap. Others think it was a person. And still others thought some other problem. Paul prayed 3 times, asking God to remove it. And each time God said no. But he gave him this promise. He said, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness." God was telling Paul that he would have to endure this thorn, whether it was physical or mental or emotional or a person. Whatever it was, God was not going to remove it. Paul would have to live with this hardship, but that God would be with him. As Jesus says, "In this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I've overcome the world." Jesus promises never to leave us or forsake us. Whatever we face, he will be with us. As he promised Paul, his grace is enough. He will give us the strength and power we need. "I will empower you to endure," he was telling Paul. "I will help you overcome. I will be there to give victory." And that same promise is ours. And we see examples of this throughout Scripture. Moses felt he was ill-equipped to speak to Pharaoh. He stammered and stuttered, but God empowered him and used him to free a nation. Gideon said he was the weakest of his tribe, and it was the weakest of the nation, the lowest of the low, but God called him a mighty warrior and empowered him to defeat the enemy with only 300 men. David, a young teenager with no military training, but a strong faith in the power of God, defeated a seasoned warrior, Goliath, a giant who terrorized everyone else. Do you feel weak? Do you feel inadequate? Are you discouraged by what you think is a handicap? Is there some thorn in the flesh in your life? Maybe you've been asking God to remove it, But perhaps God has said, no, trust me. I will be with you. My grace is enough. I will empower you. At age 17, Johnny Erickson Tata had a diving accident that left her as a quadriplegic, dramatically changing her life. After battling through some of the depression and discouragement and everything else that comes with such a life-altering experience, she came to realize that God's promise of his grace being sufficient to be true. So she began sharing her story, and in 1979 began a ministry to people with disabilities called Johnny and Friends. God has used her in amazing ways to minister to and advocate for people with disabilities. She's been on presidential advisory committees, and in 1994 started Wheels for the World to provide wheelchairs to people in developing nations. Over 150,000 have been provided. You see, God used her in amazing ways that she wouldn't have been used had she not been a quadriplegic. Johnny responded to her thorn in the flesh the same way Paul did. Here's what Paul said after God said no and promised sufficient grace. He said, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Wow. Johnny found God's grace sufficient and his power amazing, and has been used by him to run a ministry that has touched millions. Paul experienced God's grace and power and wisdom to author 13 books of the Bible and be one of the most effective missionaries and church leaders throughout history. So here's the point. Whatever you struggle with, whatever challenge you face, whatever hardships are in your life, pray. Perhaps God will choose to remove them, but maybe he will tell you no, and then promise to be with you and give you grace sufficient for you. He will make his power perfect in your weakness for your situation, and he will use you, if you let him, in ways that you would never imagine. His grace is enough for any hardship. God bless.